Hello, my name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. Okay guys, so recently I have noticed that my Where to Start with Classics video has been really blowing up for some reason after 9 months. So I've seen a lot of comments there. I've seen a lot of people finding the channel through it, which is great. If that is how you found me, hey there, welcome. But one of the things that has resulted from that is people reminding me that in that original Where to Start with Classics video, I promised a follow-up, which would be where to start with modern classics and not just sort of like classics. And I definitely wanted to go ahead and make that because, yeah, I kind of had forgotten that I'd promised that I would do that. So 9 months later, here we go. A couple of caveats here that I feel like I need to give even more so than in the original Where to Start with Classics video is that this is really going to be coming from obviously my perspective, like this is all my subjective opinion and based on what I have read. But I think even more so than in kind of classics in the English speaking world, modern classics vary quite a bit by country. So I think if you were to ask a British booktuber, for instance, what they consider to be modern classics, or an Australian booktuber, a Canadian booktuber, New Zealand, whatever, throughout the English-speaking world, I think different countries are kind of evolving their own set of a modern classic canon in a way that I'm sure has overlap, but is not one-to-one by any means. Whereas authors like the Brontes, Austen, Dickens, I think are slightly more universal throughout the English-speaking world. So I do want to just caveat by saying this is going to be a very American point of view on this list. And like I said, of course, it's also going to be nuanced by what I have or have not read. So what I would like to do is I'm going to give you guys a list of where to start with modern classics based on genre preferences. So if you like this genre, here is a modern classic that I think could work well for you. Then we're going to talk about books that I think have entered the modern classic canon that are not necessarily my personal favorites, but I think could be good places to go just based on how much I think consensus is building up around them. And then I'm going to prognosticate. I'm going to make some predictions about some books that are a little more recent, so I don't feel like we fully know what their trajectory is, but if I were a betting woman, some of the people who have published within the last 15 years or so that I think will end up making kind of the modern classics canon here shortly. So with that, we'll do where I would start. We'll do some other typical recommendations for modern classics that may not be my favorite, but just other places to go, and then some guesses about what might end up entering the modern classic canon. Okay, so first we're going to start with if you like historical fiction, 2 modern classics I would recommend. Now I will tell you, one of these is my 3rd all-time favorite book, and it is the #1 recommendation I would give to somebody looking to get into modern classics. I think that this is just such a wonderful story, very humanely told, a very compelling main character, beautiful prose, and I think really represents the best of what modern classics have to offer, and that is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. And this is the story of a butler writing a diary in the 1950s or 60s, reflecting on his time as the butler of this big English house of an important political figure in the lead up to World War II, and sort of how he now reflects on that time and like what that means about what his life has meant. I think that this is such a wonderful blend of amazing thematic content. I remember writing one of my AP English essays on this on the test. Like, it is dense and worthy of study, but it is also just such an engaging story full of beautifully rendered moments and just such a compelling character who is doing the narrative, which is Mr. Stevens. So there's also a great movie based on this book. So this is my #1 recommendation if you are wanting to start with a modern classic. I think this is great. Also, Ishiguro is an immigrant from Japan to Britain, so I think he also brings a very interesting perspective on British life in a lot of ways. Anyway, it's a side note. So that's my #1 choice. And then #2, if you somehow escaped reading Things Fall Apart in high school or at university, I would pick this as another historical fiction pick. So I was assigned this, I think, 3 different times in my schooling, but I think the reason it gets assigned so much is A, again, it's not very long. Neither of these 2 are very long. B, I think that, again, thematically, there's a ton for people to unpack in here. And see, it is just a really moving story about the impact of colonialism on different generations of Nigerians who are processing the kind of incursion from the European world into traditional Nigerian society in different ways. I think that this shows how complicated of a process that is and how disorienting it is to the people who are being colonized. You know, this idea of essentially setting father against son, brother against brother. It's also beautifully written. You'll learn a lot about yams, and just overall, I mean, there's a reason why this so quickly, I think, has entered the canon and is something so widely recommended to schools. I think both of these could be really, if you like historical fiction in particular, but just generally, those are probably my two top picks, maybe in general, but specifically for historical fiction. And speaking of Kazuo Ishiguro, we'll next do, if you like different versions of sci-fi, a couple of picks of where to start modern classics wise with that. So another Ishiguro pick is Never Let Me Go. This is one I don't want to say a lot about because I think you should just encounter it on your own, but basically this is a literary take on a dystopia, and I think this is maybe one of the newest books on everything I'm going to recommend, but it quickly, I think, kind of has gained consensus as like one of the great dystopian novels. So for dystopia, I would go with this one, and then for kind of a space adventure modern classic, I would go with The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell. This is basically the tagline a lot of people use on this is Jesuits in space, and it is about here on Earth we hear a signal from a different planet, and the Jesuits are sending a missionary out to try to reach that intelligent life, and it is told in different timelines, but it's a weeper. I mean, you've got to be ready to cry if you're going to read this book. I think recently I picked it as like the #1 book to make you cry. It is really, really hard to get through at some points, but it is beautifully written, which is a thing I'm going to say a lot in this video, and I think tackles a lot of the typical kind of questions that this genre does in an interesting way. I think it came out 95-ish. In the last 25 years, I think this has quickly kind of gained consensus as a modern classic with a sci-fi twist. Then, if you like a heavy romantic element in your fiction, and also probably this is another recommendation for people who like historical fiction, I would say Possession by A.S. Byatt. There are two different love stories happening, one in present time, one through letters of this fictitious literary couple. And again, this is another one I don't want to say a lot about. I think you should just sort of go into it and let it overcome you. I want to be clear that this is not a genre romance, but romance is a very heavy component of this one. There's a lot of interesting sort of gender sexuality stuff in this. And this also has a lot of elements of like fairy tale and a lot of meta elements about storytelling. So yeah, this is my pick if you were looking for a modern classic with a lot of kind of romantic elements driving the plot. Okay, next, let's talk about if you like coming of age stories. My first choice would be The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark. And I will tell you in general, I think Muriel Spark is a great author. If you like The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, I would definitely encourage you to continue on with her. I've read The Girls of Slender Means and The Driver's Seat. I need to read The Only Problem, but in general, she is an author whose work I've very much enjoyed. The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie is a take on a boarding school kind of story, which I know is catnip for a lot of people. It is for me. That's one of my favorite forms of sort of literary fiction, is coming of age at a boarding school or like an exclusive school kind of setting. And this is a really well executed version of that. Not super plot heavy, more just sort of character study. Miss Jean Brodie being this sort of charismatic, almost like cult-like figure at this school, who's a teacher who kind of has this group of girls swirling around her and how all their lives intertwine. There is also a movie version of this, which I've never seen, but stars the inimitable Maggie Smith, so I have to assume it's wonderful. So if you're looking for a school version of coming of age, that is my pick. And then I do want to put To Kill a Mockingbird on here by Harper Lee. Now, I do think that this book, at least in the American context, has been overly assigned as the book you read about race in America, and I think that's like this and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I think that that's a problem, and I think since I was in school, they are getting better about this on curriculums, of having more own voices, books that talk about race on syllabi, which I think is a great move. I do think if you choose to look at this as a book written right at the beginning or in the midst of the civil rights period with a coming of age component and an attempt at sort of a progressive view on race, I think with that kind of perspective, it is still a book that is really worth reading. It is very readable, so I think this is one of the most approachable books on this list because it really is told from the perspective of a child, so the language is very straightforward. The thematic content in here is, I think, rich, but pretty on the page, so you don't have to like struggle to kind of pick up what she's putting down. And there's a reason why this has become like one of the great classics of American literature here in the last little bit. I do think its kind of legacy is beginning to be complicated in a way that I think benefits it, but I still do think that this is a good example of a coming of age modern classic. Oh, and did I even say this is basically a young girl whose dad is tasked with defending a black man who's been wrongfully accused of something in 1940s Alabama, and sort of like almost like a courtroom drama in the back half of it. It's about her growing up and learning about the society around her that is filled with prejudice and hate towards the black people in her community, even while it can be very supportive towards her and her family in other ways. So I think the character learning and having a complicated view of her town and what it is like for different people in her community. And then next, if you like retellings, I've got two for you. Both of these have a very feminist twist to them, and one of them also has, I think, a really interesting take on colonialism and race in it as well, and that is Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. This is a retelling of Jane Eyre as told through the perspective of one of the side characters. I highly recommend that you read Jane Eyre before you read this, or I guess I should say, if you have any intention of ever reading Jane Eyre, please read that before you read this, because this book will spoil that book. But I think that this is a really critical text in evaluating some of the parts of Jane Eyre that are very of its time in a way that, you know, today's readers would want to complicate. I think that this opened up that dialogue really nicely, and it's also just a beautiful novel of its own. It's also very short, so it's easy to get through and has really lush descriptions of the Caribbean in the 1800s. So retelling number one is a full novel. Retelling number two is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, and these are feminist AF retellings of classic fairy tales. They are really violent and brutal. I mean, The Bloody Chamber is the titular story, and there's a lot of very interesting takes and different types of violence in these fairy tales, because if you go back and read source material for fairy tales, they are often quite violent. This is violent in a different way, and like I said, it brings a very specifically feminist point of view to a lot of those stories. If you like fairy tales, I think this is well worth pursuing, and also if you just like short stories. Arguably, probably my favorite short story collection ever. These are my picks of if you are looking for a retelling modern classic. Then if you are looking for something kind of mystery horror modern classic wise, first I would say The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, because honestly, this is the book that is probably one of the most influential books on modern horror as it exists today. People like Stephen King cite this book as highly influential. Not going to be one for everyone, but I absolutely love this book. Shirley Jackson in general, if you've never read her short stories, are really also worth pursuing if you're just looking for like kind of horror short stories in general, like The Lottery, etc. She does that extremely well in short form. But The Haunting of Hill House, I think, really gets at what it means to have modern horror, because it is a book that is highly ambiguous about how real or not real different haunted house elements are in this book. And overall, I absolutely love this. So this is very influential and also I think very accessible as a modern classic. The other kind of mystery horror type pick I had was Secret History by Donna Tartt, which is another one that is more of a contemporary pick. It's been, you know, I think within the last 20 years. Maybe like early 2000s kind of thing. It is a murder mystery set within this elite society of people who are studying ancient Greek at this very uppity up private university. You kind of know who done it from the beginning, but it is showing you how done it and why done it. It is a very strong flavor, so it is not going to be for everyone, but I personally really enjoy it, and I really love, it's a very evocative book. Like, it has a very specific mood to it, and I think if you're into that mood, you will end up liking the book. A read-alike title I often see for this, and I have not read this other book, so I can't tell you, is If We Were Villains by somebody or other, Rio. So if you liked that book, I have heard often people like the one they read first better. So if you've already read that book, maybe you wouldn't like The Secret History as much. I don't know, but anyway, apparently very similar vibes there. And then 5 picks that are just sort of general literary fiction that I think if you just tend to like literary fiction pretty well, these would definitely be worth your while. Stoner by John Williams is one of the most perfect novels I've ever read in terms of just like perfectly realizing what it is trying to do. It is a character study of a professor, I think at the University of Missouri in the early part of the 20th century, and literally it's just following him basically from cradle to grave. A very quiet character study study, beautifully written. Like I said, I think just executed perfectly. So if you like just sort of, character-driven literary fiction, this you will enjoy, I think. Gilead by Marilynne Robinson is set, again, I think in kind of the early part of the 20th century, dealing a lot with topics of race, racial justice, and forgiveness across generations from the perspective of a white pastor who is getting on in life, but married very late in life to a younger woman, and so therefore has a young son. And this is him writing in his diary, reflecting on basically what he wants his son to know, because he likely will not be there to teach him everything, but documenting what happens when sort of a prodigal son comes back into their community. And again, just the writing in this is beautiful, not plot driven, though it does, it has a plot, but it's much more of a character study and about, kind of beautiful prose and dwelling on themes and whatnot. So Marilynne Robinson is a really beautiful stylist. So if you like this, she's got a lot of essays and stuff too that you probably also would enjoy. Caveat here, Flannery O'Connor. I would say A Good Man Is Hard to Find is probably in contention for me for my favorite collection of short stories with The Bloody Chamber. It's one of those two, and I absolutely love these short stories. They are very much documents of their time. They were written in the 50s Georgia, like the South, and they do deal a lot with themes of race. I think O'Connor saw herself as somewhat of an outsider in the South because she was Catholic, and if you don't know, in America, the South is highly dominated culturally by evangelical Protestantism. So I think she sees herself as a commenter and critiquer of that kind of religious tradition and its hypocrisies, and I think one of those hypocrisies she wants to comment upon is the racism of the South of that era, but that means she does present characters who are racist. Like, that's just kind of the bottom line. So I know that that is something that is not for everyone, especially in terms of the kinds of language and slurs she does use in portraying those characters. So I want to caveat that. I think that she is always looking on those themes with a critical lens, and therefore to me her stories still are incredibly relevant, incredibly impactful. She has a style that is often referred to as Southern Gothic. These are very violent stories and very shocking stories, especially in their time period. Maybe less now. I think it's harder to shock us sometimes now, but in their day they were considered very whoa, you went there. So anyway, I just think that these still really have very interesting things to say about, like I said, kind of like hypocrisy. What does it, she's trying to use the grotesque or very extreme versions of characters or ideas to comment on more mainstream characters or ideas that people kind of take as normal or for granted. Love this. I understand that this won't be a pick for everyone, so I do just want to give some of those warnings or that kind of context for that recommendation. A read-alike for Jane Austen, but in the 20th century for me, is Barbara Pym. I've read a few of her novels and have really enjoyed them. They are very much novels of manners. And to me, the best one is Excellent Women. I also think that I've seen kind of back and forth on this. I think a lot of people see a lot of queer elements to these stories or potential readings of queer elements in these stories, which I would tend to agree with, but I know people go back and forth on that. But Excellent Women is an excellent book, and it's very quiet, but it's just sort of about the life and times of this woman in 1950s Britain, kind of what roles she plays in society and how that may or may not be constraining. So like I said, I think a lot of times you see Barbara Pym compared very favorably to Jane Austen. I don't think she's as readable, and her books are not romances in the same way that Jane Austen's often are, but in terms of just sort of observing domestic life, she's very much of that same ilk. And then finally, If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. I read this last year as a part of a book club because of the movie that was coming out, and when I tell you this is a book that could have been written this year, depressingly so in terms of its themes, it is incredibly relevant for this current moment, and I think will be very readable to today's readers. Basically, this is about systemic racial injustice in the American judicial system and how easy it is for specifically Black young men to be railroaded and abused by that system. Very readable in terms of its prose, beautiful, simple, but comprehensible. It's not hard to get through. Like I said, I think incredibly relevant for our current moment. Also not very long, so easy to recommend in terms of it's not a huge time and commitment to get through it either. That rounds it out for the first part. So secondly, I do want to just shout out a few that are not personal favorites of mine, but I think could be other good places to go for modern classics, so we'll do that now. So in terms of ones that I put down as books that personally are not my favorites, but I think are clearly modern classics that a lot of people really connect with or love, or that I haven't read yet, but feel like they get mentioned so much, I did wanted to shout them out real quick. The first is the single biggest bet I have of somebody who transcends even being just a modern classic and is quickly getting fast-tracked to becoming like a classic of the English-speaking canon, and that is Toni Morrison. The only book that I have read from her is Beloved. I did that as a teen and honestly just didn't really connect with it. She is an author I want to try again as an adult and as somebody with like more context, I think, for even understanding her work. The one that I would say is I think has kind of emerged as her masterpiece, I then gets cited the most often or read the most often, is Beloved. But I've also heard great things about Song of Solomon and The Bluest Eye. Those are probably the next ones I'm going to try from her. So if I were going to put a bet on somebody who's not just going to be a modern classic, but is going to be like a classic, it's Toni Morrison. So I think she's worth looking at. A couple other ones that I have not, well, either I haven't read or haven't read in a long time. I know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou and her poetry in general. Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich, and The Things They Carried by Tim O'Leary, maybe? Those are all ones that I think are pretty firmly established as modern classics. Also, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. That's one that I personally didn't really connect with the writing or the story, even if I like the themes, but obviously there's a huge TV series about it. That's one a lot of people have looked to, especially since 2016. I think is very relevant, but I think it is pretty firmly ensconced as a modern classic, and a lot of others. The good news about modern classics, and I think ones that are sort of making their way towards the kind of English-speaking literary canon, is that unlike, I think, books before 1950, we're going to be seeing a lot more diversity in terms of the kinds of points of views that are represented, in terms of gender and race and sexuality and religion. Like, I think that we're seeing a lot more things kind of getting pushed up and bubbled up as potentials for modern classic kind of status. And I think that that will eventually translate into having a lot more diversity in general in the classics canon. So I think that will be interesting. You know, scholars 100 years from now, it will be interesting to see kind of like what I think will be pretty clear is a very big shift in terms of books being talked about or fast-tracked in that way, having a lot more voices contributing to that canon. And then finally, I thought that I would just sort of make some guesses of authors or books that I think are coming here, at least in the US, as being likely contenders of books that are going to be quickly considered to be modern classics. Books or authors. So my number one pick is, I think that Roxane Gay is going to become a modern classic author. This is her short story collection Aidi, which is one of my all-time favorites. I absolutely love this. But Hunger and all of the other books that she's been putting forward, I think that she's going to become a mainstay on different syllabi for people here in the next 10 years. I think Hilary Mantel's trilogy about, is it Thomas Cromwell, Wolf Hall, all of those, I think that they're just so dominant whenever they come out in terms of people just absolutely loving those. I think that's going to become a modern classic of sort of historical type fiction. I think Colson Whitehead, he writes in a lot of different genres, but you know, between historical fiction, he's got a zombie book, he's got a lot of different kind of modes he's written in. I think he's emerging, I think, as somebody who will become modern classic. Those are my guesses of ones that I think could enter modern classic territory. Okay, and I think that will do it for my recommendations on where to start with modern classics, along with some side recommendations and some prognostication. Modern classics, there's so many more that you could pick from than even just sort of like traditional classics, because I think the sort of winnowing from the pool into classicdom is a little bit bigger at the modern classics level. So I am sure that there are plenty of other places that one could start with modern classics. So feel free, if you are a lover, more literary fiction of the last 60-ish years, to put in a where to start with pick from your reading, because like I said, I think that there's just a lot more books that one could kind of put the label of modern classic on, and therefore even more places that one could start. So those are my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. So if you did, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, and I think that that will do it. I hope you are having an absolutely lovely day today, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye.